And now put it. It's probably me.
Oh, hold on.
Wait. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. I feel like that's.
You can put that one.
Trying to make sure it's a good angle.
He's gonna move around on this, all we can do for now.
Oh Lord. Okay. I feel like this is good. It feels tall enough that everyone can see. Well, you know what? It's gonna have to be good. It's gonna have to be good, I think. I don't know if should I want them to see the. I'm wondering the same thing. Right there. I'm wondering if we should put it right there, just so we can actually see.
You can't see the top?
Not particularly well.
1 second.
Could have people's attention for a little bit.
Maybe, yeah.
We're going to be beginning momentarily. Dr. McDuffie will be coming into the classroom momentarily. Just have to do, shall we say, one of those nature breaks.
Oh my god.
Like right here. Oh, there's a bag there.
Better watch this. Make sure no one knocks it over. Okay.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Does that feel like fun?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Because he's gonna move around. I think that's good. Where's Dr. Eugene? I'm wondering here, Tiasha. I'm wondering if we should pick this up. Is there a way? Can I put this through here, just so that no one steps on it?
Yeah.
I don't want anyone to ruin your stuff.
No, you're good.
Okay. I think good job we got here. We did it. Okay. I want to see if anyone can see the live. I need to ask him if anyone is. Can someone check the live?
Yeah, it's kind of like I guess kind of more health food picture. I like it. Yeah, and yeah, so it's all up there until and we'll start figuring out moving around.
So how's the living better
Better than there. Way cheaper. No, I'm on Queen Street right now by the library. And you know, I got pretty lucky on a decent spot. Montreal, it's like, you can get like a 2-3 downtown, $1,600.
You do?
Yeah.
One of the guys I used to work with when I was at Quaker was district manager back, and his son owns 3 houses.
Shakima.
Really dirt cheap. He bought 3 houses.
No. Because you can't. Hey, girl. Sorry.
When I retired, we do condos,
See where it's pointing at? Is he gonna be there, or is he sitting at the?
No, he's gonna walk and talk.
Okay. Oh, okay. Perfect.
So you can see it when you go.
Yeah. This is what it looks like. Yeah, this is what I'm looking at right now. Shakima, please.
We already experimented the first time. So
Yeah. It's fine here. They just have to be a little careful. Maybe I can shift it over a bit more.
so much cleaner than
Thank you all for coming out on a Monday night. I truly appreciate that for what I think will be an incredibly stimulating, provocative, and I think exceptionally necessary talk, given the conditions that we are living in today, right? So I don't think a talk of this nature that focuses on the Black liberation struggle, both not only globally, but I'm sure contemporarily, but also drawing campus connection here, can only be apt for the moment that we're living in today. And the conversation that Dr. Eugene and I had with Dr. Eric Duffy today sort of underlined that. I first want to underscore that we have an incredible privilege and honor of being able to host Dr. McDuffie here today, simply because of his really quite huge reputation within the field, the kind of groundbreaking work that he has done. And so I was very happy when he emailed me to say, listen, Isaac, could you organize a talk for me? And I just did it at the drop of a hat. Dr. Eugene and I were excited about doing it, and Dr. Eugene, among others of us, have used his work in our classes. This lecture is going to be, I think, particularly profound. I would like to also say that it's also part, a few weeks ago on February 27th, we had Muriel Fanon, Mendes Francis, who was here, who gave a brilliant lecture and a huge discussion about reparations, but also connecting it, that radical conception of reparations to global black liberation, but also the cause of humanity. So many of you who might be interested, have heard about the Black and African Diaspora Studies Program. I encourage you to take the brochure and consider doing a minor, if not a major, in the program as well. Dr. Eugene teaches, of course, Black radical thought, which I think everybody will find very interesting. And of course, some of you who are in my Introduction to African Canadian Studies course will know we will be engaging with the global black liberation struggle and how it connected to Canada. And I think this lecture is also important historiographically, because quite often Canada is seen as not being connected to what unfolded in the 1960s and broader struggles, and particularly the black community. There was a book written in 1968 by Tariq Ali, and he made no mention of Canada, right? Okay? And I think it's important to understand that Canada does not exist in isolation in some sort of glass case, but has been part and parcel, flesh and blood, part of this global international struggle. So today's lecture, Louis Langdon, Garvey, and Malcolm X, Unraveling the Canadian Links to Global Black Liberation, is going to be thought-provoking, and I think will call important attention to the critical importance of Canada to global black liberation through tracing the diaspora journey and legacy of Louis Langdon, the great and born Pan-Africanist, grassroots organizer, best known as the mother of Malcolm X, who often forgotten. Dr. McDuffie will explore the deep and often overlooked connections between these iconic figures in Canada as we mark the 60th anniversary of Malcolm X's assassination and the centenary of his birth. Also the centenary of the birth of Frantz Fanon, 70th anniversary of the Great Bandung Conference, among so many anniversaries. And illuminate how this legacy intersects with Marcus Garvey's visions and the enduring impact of Louis Langdon, Malcolm's ex-mother, as I mentioned, who first arrived in St. John, New Brunswick, before settling in Montreal. He will elucidate the connections of Bob Marley's revolutionary artistry, delving into Canada's historical role in black liberation movements, and uncover the ties to these global icons and their shared pursuit of justice, self-determination, and African unity. So thank you for actually coming to this opportunity to discuss these powerful legacies that not only continue to shape our world, but are so necessary and imperative today if we wish to create a world fit for humanity and in which doesn't place profit above human beings. Dr. McDuffie, I'm honored, privileged, and I'm so excited to have him here as a guest, is Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign campus, and author of Sojourning for Freedom, Black Women and American Communism, and the Making of Black Feminism, which came out with Duke Press in 2011, and also has just been appointed the Director of the Center of African Studies at the University of Illinois. Now, I should also say he has Canadian roots, right? His great-grandmother was born in St. Kitts, and his grandmother was born and raised in Toronto, and he's visited here often. And Dr. Eugene and I were having an earlier tea with him, tea/coffee, and we talked about these interconnections, and so it's great to have him here as well. His latest book is The Second Battle for Africa, Garveyism, the U.S. Heartland, and Global Black Freedom. And I just want to read a sample of some of the samples of praises for this book, right? One sample written by Gerald Horn, and we hope to bring Gerald Horn here next year. Gerald Horn is an incredible scholar of American history and also of the Americas history, and we hope to bring him here. And some of you are familiar with the much maligned 1619 Project. He, in many cases, was the intellectual sort of foundation for that work. So he says, McDuffie's book is unlike previous works that examine Garveyism up to Garvey's deportation, in that he carries the story forward into the 20th century. More than this, he expertly examines the many formations influenced by Garvey. He then cites these trends in the diasporic Midwest, working to establish this region as a hotbed of Garvey's legacy. And the Second Battle for Africa is a superior work of scholarship. Elaine Morris, Hall Professor of Feminist Studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, says, the Second Battle for Africa is a sweeping tour de force, uncovering and recovering more persistent and ruptures in the history of the Black freedom struggle by incorporating gender and queer theory and combining the global diasporic perspective with a regional focus. Dr. McDuffie brings new lenses to the study of Garveyism and Black nationalism. And all of this will connect to Canada. So without any further ado, Dr. McDuffie, you have the floor. Thank you.
All right. Good evening.
Good evening.
Bonsoir. Bonsoir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
There we go. There we go. Wow. Dr. Sani, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And Dr. Eugene, thank you very much for the conversation this afternoon. A real pleasure meeting you, and what I hope and think will be the start of some very long, interesting conversations. My goodness, where to begin? As Dr. Sani pointed out, and I'm very, very proud of this. Yes, my grandmother was born and raised in Toronto. My great-grandmother was born and raised in St. Kitts in the Caribbean. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. My mother's family, with whom I really came up the most with, her family lived in the Midwest, the U.S. Midwest, Ohio, Michigan, going back at least to the 1830s. My father from South Carolina, so again, a kind of great migration. But again, and then I was raised in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. I was very fortunate. My parents bought a vacation home in Puerto Rico when I was young. Started going to Puerto Rico when I was 6. That really helped me to understand the world. Of course, Puerto Rico is a U.S. Commonwealth. Might get me in trouble in certain places by calling it a colony, but that's what I would argue that it is. But my point is that, again, the fact that my grandmother was from Toronto, I spent a lot of time as a kid in Canada. I didn't know my great-grandmother super well, but again, I knew that she was from the West Indies, or from the islands, as we would say, given the fact that, again, I spent time in Puerto Rico, that my life has always been transnational, global, diasporic. Like so many folks here, like your lives have crossed international boundaries, right? That your lives, your families, your histories are not constrained by Canada or by the United States or France or from wherever you hail. My goodness, so much to discuss. And Dr. Sani, so I know that we have a dinner date later tonight here, and we don't want to keep the students too long, especially on a Monday night. Now I should note, some years ago I was the international speaker at the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. I spoke for 90 minutes, and nobody left the room. Nobody left. And I see people looking at me like, oh my goodness, is he going to talk for 90 minutes? No, I'm not going to talk for 90 minutes. In fact, I'll probably just talk about 40, so that we have plenty of time to have a Q&A. And I'm going to give this talk more as a college-style lecture. I'm not going to just read from a paper. Again, I don't have anything against that, but especially again that I see that so many students here, I think that would be more useful. And again, and we are being live streamed, no?
Yes.
So whatever I'm saying is going global, right?
Yeah.
It might be recorded somewhere, right? Hey, I'm gonna bring it. I thought, and also why I did not prepare a written paper, because so much is happening so quickly across the world that day to day it's hard to keep up with things. So for example, folks, I'll just say, right, what we're seeing in the United States is fascism. Should I say that again? Did folks hear me? Yeah. Right? What we're seeing in the United States right now is fascism. And we're seeing, it's also though important to keep in mind that we're seeing these fascist authoritarian movements, leaders, occurring across the globe. Right? Right. So, but what we also want to do is we want to make sure that we understand that how we got to this current moment didn't just happen overnight. That this has been occurring for decades in the States and beyond. Going back and again, what I say to my students, write this down, right? And so back in 1951, the brilliant black communist leader, intellectual lawyer, William L. Patterson wrote a classic petition to the United Nations titled "We Charge Genocide," in which he, in a very clear way, laid out a case in which African Americans were experiencing genocide akin to, or how the UN defined genocide. And he argued that black people in the United States always lived under fascist-like conditions. He was not the first person from the States to try to take the United States before the United Nations and charge the U.S. with violating African American human rights. Dr. Du Bois did that in 1947. Paul Robeson, the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, a path-breaking black radical women's organization, tried to do so in 1951. Of course, Brother Malcolm tried to do so as well. But again, folks, we are living through some times. And again, that these authoritarian, fascist regimes that embrace racism, xenophobia, heteropatriarchy, transphobia, right? All these tendencies are incredibly race, gender, right? But again, this isn't just happening in the United States. It's occurring globally. And it behooves us. It is critical. If there's a time for us to know history, if there's a time for us to appreciate the transformative power of black studies, Africana studies, African studies, black Canadian studies, the time is now. Y'all hear me? All right. Let's break it down. And I'll just say a few words, and I will just read a short part of this paper. Again, I want to give Dr. Sani credit for this program that you have that you have here. And correct me if I'm wrong, sir. This is the first program in Canada that provides an undergraduate major, right?
Yes.
Right? In Black Studies, right? In African Diaspora Studies, right? And this is, folks, sometimes we don't appreciate what we have until when someone tries to take it away from us, which of course is happening in the States. What I'm doing, and again, and I hope this doesn't sound, crazy, it's not beyond the possibility that African American studies, what we do, will be declared illegal, right? That might sound paranoid, but no, it's not. The things that are happening daily, right? Hundreds of Venezuelan undocumented people being shipped, right? Expelled from the United States over a court order, right? Right? Oh my goodness, I wish I had the time. All right. Scholars in Canada, especially of African descent, are at the front lines in producing cutting-edge scholarship in multiple fields: Black Canadian history, African diaspora studies, Black women's studies, Black queer studies, and performance studies, among others. This work has moved Canada from the margins to the center of discussions of global Africa. The scholarship is, the scholarship is rethinking, destabilizing, and unsettling commonly held assumptions about slavery, memory, citizenship, state violence, sexuality, indigeneity, empire, settler colonialism, migration, borders, culture, resistance, diaspora making, the African world, and the meaning of freedom. This work is critical for challenging, quote, the continual construction of Canada as a geographically and demographically white place and space, end quote, as historians Michelle A. Johnson, and Funke Aladejebe assert in the monumental edited anthology, Unsettling the Great White North, Black Canadian History. In addition, African Canadian scholars have challenged the prevailing, quote, story of slavery in Canada, end quote, which, as historian Cooper argues, who of course Dr. Cooper was here for several years, argues, quote, is locked in the national closet. That's slavery, quote, is locked in the national closet, a well-guarded secret, so well-guarded that even scholars who have made slavery their business do not know about the Canadian variant, end quote. So what we want to do today is, through examining the life, diasporic journey, and critical time, key time, this short but a very important time that Louise Langdon lived here in Canada, to appreciate Canada's links to global black liberation and the centrality, folks, and please write this down, right? The centrality of black women, the centrality of African descendant women to fighting for imagining another world that is possible, right? All right. Okay, good. Let me say a few things about what my new book is about. The Second Battle for Africa, Garveyism, the U.S. Heartland, and Global Black Freedom. It's a book that took 15 years of research. I conducted research here in Canada, Ghana, Liberia, Grenada, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Liberia, South Africa, the UK, and of course the United States. And what I'm doing here is I'm using Garveyism to appreciate the global impact, of the U.S. Midwest, the 12 states that comprise what we now call the Midwest. That region's importance in shaping the history and struggles and freedom dreams of black people globally. Second Battle for Africa. And I'll explain a little bit later. In fact, why don't I explain right now what the title's the meaning of the title. A gentleman by the name of Reverend Clarence Harding from Chicago, who was born in the early 20th century. His parents were hardcore members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, co-founded by Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey in Kingston, Jamaica in 1914. Reverend Harding, in the 60s, in 1966, was assigned to the West African country of Liberia, which Garveyites and black nationalists prior to the 20s and the height of the Garvey movement had identified as the beachhead for global black liberation, Pan-African struggles. And Harding, in a letter to a colleague in the States, wrote, yes, we lost the first battle for Africa in the 1920s. Good evening. But now in the 1960s, during the height of during the most militant radical phase of African liberation, that we will prevail in the second battle for Africa. In the second battle for Africa. All right. All right. Marcus Garvey is, I'm always hesitant. I don't subscribe to the great man in history thesis that, again, where scholars, they identify, again, men, typically white men, as the engines of change. However, it's undeniable that Marcus Garvey was absolutely critical to shaping the 20th century black world and onward. And as you may know, and this speaks directly to the topic for today. In 1937, Marcus Garvey was returning from a 6-week stay in Ontario, where he visited Toronto, Windsor, attended the second regional conference of the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association. And on his way back to the Caribbean, he stopped in Sydney, Nova Scotia. And he met with some of his followers, and he gave what has become a very famous speech, in which one of his most famous lines were, "We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind." And if you're a fan of Bob Marley, the great Jamaican artist, brilliant artist, Redemption Song, of course, where he famously said, again, based off of Garvey, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds," right? Redemption Song. Songs of freedom. Redemption Song, right? Right? And again, this famous line from one of Bob Marley's most beautiful, powerful songs, right, was a spin, a play off of Marcus Garvey's quote, statement, which he gave here in Nova Scotia. So again, we have to understand the centrality of Canada, in particular Nova Scotia, to the histories and struggles of black people. But again, folks, in fact, I almost said class, because I thought I was back with my students, right? So folks, again, please note those well, right? The history of African descended people in what is now Canada, Turtle Island, right, goes back to at least 1628, right? So let's not fall into the trap that African peoples first arrived in Canada with the so-called, with the black loyalists. The presence of African people has been here since the beginning of what became modern day Canada. And of course, up in Glace Bay, the UNIA is still very active in Glace Bay. Again, speaking to the longevity of Garveyism. And in short, if you're unfamiliar with Garveyism, again, the Universal Negro Improvement Association was the largest black movement in history, claiming more than 6 million members at its peak in the early 20s. Its members lived, of course, in the States, Canada, the Caribbean, Central America, West Africa, South Africa, East Africa, Australia, and Europe, as well as South America. And at the core, right, again, Garvey, his ideas, or rather, he wasn't the first person to articulate so much of his program. But again, the unique conjunction of global, local, regional, national, global events helped to propel, or rather, his message fell on the black masses who were very receptive to his message. The message of African redemption, the independence of Africa from European colonialism, black pride, armed self-defense, right? Garvey used the term human rights, right? Used the term human rights to call for the freedom of black people. And as we will discuss, black women. People like Louise Langdon were at the forefront of the Garvey movement. All right, so folks, a quick show of hands. How many folks have read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Okay, about a third of the room. I would strongly urge you to read this book. It is it's brilliant, it's powerful, it's not beyond critique. People for a very long time have argued that the book is in some ways more of Alex Haley's story, the African American journalist, than Malcolm's story. But still, again, It is a must read. It is a must read. I don't want to spoil the book, but it begins with Louise Little, as she's known in the States, Louise Langdon, as she is known in the Caribbean, Canada, and elsewhere. In fact, so there's a photograph, actually two photographs spliced, a photograph of Louise Langdon and a photograph of her husband, Earl Little, an African American. And the novel, rather the autobiography, right, it starts with her pregnant. And encountering the Ku Klux Klan, who have come to their home in Omaha, Nebraska, threatening, telling Louise Little, asking the whereabouts of Earl Little, and saying that we're, again, the Klansmen on horseback, and the whites, the white hoods and torches and everything, again, trying to intimidate the Littles, to tell them to stop preaching, or rather, to tell Earl Little to stop preaching about Marcus Garvey. Louise Little said, "My husband's not here." And this was, of course, in 1925. But again, this is important. She was pregnant at the time. And in fact, she was pregnant with Brother Malcolm. And according to the autobiography of Malcolm X, she turned her body so that the Klansmen could see her pregnant abdomen that she was expecting. And the purpose of the story is to show how, from even before Malcolm's birth, right, that he was already in the fire, right, in the target of white supremacists, of racism, right? That, again, even before he was born, he was fighting. But what the autobiography of Malcolm X doesn't do, the autobiography talks about Earl Little as the Garveyite, but essentially but frames Louise Little as a good, faithful wife and devout mother, which very much simplifies the story here. And let's get to it. The story of Louise Little, Louise Langdon, begins here. Or in some ways starts here, in Grenada. And by chance, perhaps we have some folks here, or whose families hail from Grenada, perhaps? Yeah, I saw, no, okay, it's all good. I dig this photograph, right? It's beautiful, right? And it's warm, too. Unlike this classroom, that cold wind that's blowing through that window, right? So it's all good. Louise Langdon, her story in part starts in Grenada. She was born in approximately 1894. And what's especially interesting is that her grandparents, Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon, were what were called liberated Africans. That they were actually they were born in Africa. They were born in modern-day Nigeria. And according to family lore, they were Yoruba, the largest African ethnic group on the planet. And they were also Muslim. Now, of course, none of this appears in the autobiography of Malcolm X. None of this appears in the autobiography of Malcolm X. But through research that I've done and others have done, have uncovered these fascinating, powerful, global, transnational, diasporic links. Trigger warning, and the autobiography of Malcolm X does disclose this. Louise Langdon was a product of rape, right? Of sexual violence. That story is discussed briefly in the autobiography of Malcolm X. And it's true. In fact, her mother was 11 years old when she was sexually assaulted by a white man who apparently had a penchant, a thirst for sexually assaulting black girls and women. And from that horrible crime came Louise Little. She was fair complected, in some cases could pass for white. But despite the violence that was committed against her. In fact, she had no connection to her father, although it's interesting, and I'm happy to talk about this perhaps during the Q&A. You may have seen her passport photo. It said Norton. That was the name of her white biological father. And it's interesting that she used that she signed her name Norton on the passport. We can talk about that later. But again, despite the violence, no. This is not a story of victimhood. This is a story in terms of Louise Langdon, of resilience, of brilliance, creativity. And again, she grew up on an island. If you've been to Grenada, like all the islands across the Caribbean, but of course, Grenada has its own unique, distinct history, culture of opposition of indigenous people resisting European colonialism, African people resisting European colonialism and enslavement. In 1795, Julien Faidon, who led a Haitian revolution-like uprising across the island, which freed half the island, or going back to the mid-1650s, when a group of Arawak warriors who refused to surrender, who jumped from a cliff so they wouldn't surrender to the French. All of these stories she knew. And if you go to Grenada today, right? Dr. Sonny, I'm sure you've heard these stories before, right? They are alive and well. So she came from a society, a family that was deeply proud, who valued self-reliance and independence, who valued knowledge of self, as Garvey himself would call it, and of course would be picked up by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. But like so many people from the Caribbean, of course, there's a map of Grenada and its location in case you're unfamiliar with where it is. Like so many people from the Caribbean then and now, she didn't have any real opportunities on the island, so she decided to migrate, and she came to Canada. And while she spent only 2 years here, only 2 years, she arrived in 1917. And you can see that she took a steamer that took her to St. John, New Brunswick, and from New Brunswick she traveled down to Montreal, where she lived two extremely important years. And by moving to Montreal, she lived with her uncle Edgerton, who was actually right here. That is her uncle, who was a major figure in the Montreal UNIA, the Montreal UNIA, the Toronto UNIA, the Sydney UNIA. These were hotbeds, just global hotbeds. Again, not just here in Canada, right? But again, globally. Is it making sense? I'm not putting folks to sleep now, am I? Y'all with me now, right?
Yeah.
All right now. Okay, very good. So Louise Langdon, she resided in Little Burgundy, which was then, for a very, very long time, an Afro-Caribbean neighborhood in Montreal, which has increasingly been gentrified, very much gentrified. But yeah, and it was in Montreal where she joined the UNIA, where she became a devout Garveyite, Pan-Africanist, Black internationalist. And also where, of course, she would meet and marry her husband, Earl Little. So again, 2 years, but some of the most important years of her life. From Montreal, the Littles came down to Philadelphia, where they started their family. And by the early 20s, the Littles moved to Omaha, Nebraska. And I do apologize. I should have included the map for those folks who are unfamiliar with the U.S. geography here. My apology. They had Brother Malcolm in 1925. And what you see on the right of the screen is an article that Louise Langdon wrote that was published in the Negro World, which was the official newspaper of the UNIA. It was globally circulated, published not only in English, but in French and in Spanish. And in some ways it's too bad, because you see this short report about the Omaha UNIA, but on the same page you have reports from UNIA divisions, as they were called, UNIA locals from across the world. So from Canada, from Cuba, from Panama, from Ghana, from South Africa, all on the same page. So again, folks, don't think that today we all, because we have phones, somehow we're the first kind of globally connected people out here, right? Right? African people have understood, oh my goodness, here we go, right? Have understood, right, our destiny, one God, one aim, one destiny, the motto of the UNIA, right? Have understood the African liberation movement in global terms for centuries. And again, Louise Langdon was very much immersed in here. And I did this photograph here, right? So there's a young Malcolm. Little cutie pie now. Yeah, right? Look at him. Little sweet, yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful photograph, no? And what's so important here, right? This is key. Is that, yes, Louise Little, so she was the secretary. She was the secretary of the Omaha UNIA. So yes, in some ways very gendered in terms of hierarchies of power within the Garvey movement. But at the same time, the Garvey movement, or rather women, African descended women, very much, right, seized the moment and forged a voice, found a voice for themselves within the UNIA. And so they challenged the racism of white men, they challenged the sexism of black men, and if you ever have the opportunity, or if you read my book and other books that have come out, it's just full of stories of Garvey women, again, fighting for African redemption, institution building, while at the very, very same time, right, the very, very same time, challenging the patriarchy, the sexism of black male Garveyite figures. All right, and again, what was key for Louise Langdon was instilling those Garveyite values, those black internationalist values within her children. And again, none of this is in the autobiography of Malcolm X, right? She spoke French, she spoke Creole, she spoke English, right? She had her children recite the French alphabet. She had her children read T.A. Marichaux's newspaper from Grenada. If you're unfamiliar with T.A. Marichaux, he was a key, not only a Grenadian nationalist, but again was very much a kind of pan-Caribbean thinker, right? Trying to create a federation of Caribbean islands and states. And boy, do we need something like that today, right? But not a kind of neoliberal federation. We need a kind of black radical federation. Yes, and I'm saying this live. Yes, I said it. Yes, I did. All right. However, the story does take a troubling turn. Again, if you've read the autobiography of Malcolm X, the first chapter is titled Nightmare. Why? Because of the Littles, the family, their race pride, they're brilliant. I mean, those folks were brilliant. In fact, when the Littles moved to Lansing, Michigan, that's where Brother Malcolm grew up. Of course, they became well known among white folks in the area as those smart N-words, right? Which at one level, you almost want to laugh, right? In terms of the insanity of white supremacy, right? Referring to the Littles as those smart N-words. And again, something I'm doing in my book, and just so I'm clear, right? So again, I'm arguing that the Midwest constitutes then and now a generative site for black freedom. Why? Because of what I call the dialectic of opportunity and oppression. I won't go deep into it, but what I argue is that there are unique historical forces that have made that region in the States, again, a hotbed of black freedom, making of black liberation. Why and how? At one level, black folks enjoyed unprecedented economic and political opportunities that they could find nowhere else on the planet, going back to the end of the 18th century, right? So for example, right quick, the Midwest technically was free of slavery prior to the U.S. Civil War. During the 20th century, the Midwest was the site of the most advanced capitalist manufacturing on the planet. Places like Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Gary, Akron, Youngstown, St. Louis. Cities so often today heralded or perceived as the symbols of the urban crisis. Woo, these places were, again, centers of capitalist accumulation and symbols of modernity, which helps explain why hundreds of thousands of black people moved, more than 500,000 black people, more than any other, in terms of the Great Migration, went to Chicago, right? And why, of course, millions of people from across the world went to the Midwest. At the very same time, the Midwest was a site of distinct and virulent racial oppression, going back to the 18th century. And this ties very much into black loyalists, because all this is happening at the same time. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, which technically closed slavery to the region that is now the Midwest. There were 6 states in the East: Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. But the Northwest, and again, the Northwest Ordinance, often framed as this radical abolitionist tract. No. What it did, it created a template for white settler colonialism, for the expansion, for the dispossession of indigenous people from their lands. And it also included a fugitive slave clause, which made its way into the 1787 U.S. Constitution. And in the early 19th century, the state where I came up in, Ohio, led the way by passing what were called black laws. I mean, again, and that's what they were actually called, black laws, right? Which banned the migration of black people to Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, which banned black people from, black kids from going to public schools. Arguably, the first lynching in the U.S. occurred in 1836, rather in St. Louis. Moving forward right quick, going into the 20th century. Oh, and in fact, just right quick, those black laws anticipated post-Civil War black codes across the South, right? And again, it's important that we understand how the history here is linked to the history of the states, right? When black people from the states, right, left the U.S., again, contrary to how it's taught in the U.S., right? And folks know this, right? That more African people fought with the British than with the Americans in the War of Independence. Folks know that, right? I mean, especially here, I think folks probably know that, right? And of course, oh my goodness, yes, I'm going there. Yes, I know I'm on TV here. I will say it, right? So next year is the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. I doubt that we'll hear any of this kind of conversation about how more black people fought with the British than with the Americans. But again, how the U.S. was and is a hotbed of generative white supremacy, as is Canada as well. Okay, and then of course, just right quick, again, tying it back to Louise Langdon, also places like Central Michigan, Chicago, Indianapolis were hotbeds of the Ku Klux Klan, of fascist, right-wing, racist movements. So what happens, the long and the short, and this is in the autobiography of Malcolm X, the government, or rather the state of Michigan, targets the little family. Malcolm and his siblings got involved in petty crime, shoplifting. Their father died tragically, according to the autobiography of Malcolm X, was killed by the Black Legion, a fascist Klan-like formation, right? And then, but what I argue here in my book is that we need, and so what happens to Louise Little? The state of Michigan, this is important, the state of Michigan, right, sends social workers to investigate the family, right? And again, this is not unique and distinct to the U.S. This happens in Canada, this happened in Australia, this happened in all the settler countries, right? The way in which black families get framed is pathological. The ways in which the state separates and breaks up black families, and in particular for black women. The ways in which, again, so-called madness, mental health, right, is pathologized, or rather the ways in which black women and their bodies become pathologized. So what happens? In 1939, Louise Little, rather a white judge, rules Louise Little as insane, and this document that you see on the right, the top right, this probate court record, said, you can see it says in the matter of Louise Little, it says insane, and the evidence that they use, they say because she had a child out of wedlock. They say because she often talks to herself. She says because people are talking about her. She said that the government is after her, right? And the way the state of Michigan, right, framed her body, her resistance as as a working class African, Afro-Caribbean migrant, a Garveyite. And lastly, it says, and perhaps folks can see here in the record, it says that she claims that she is of royal blood. But again, if you're a Garveyite and you believe that, right, that God was black, and I don't mean like off-white, I mean black, right, that possibly her grandfather may have been a head man in West Africa, and where again, Garveyites emphasize black pride, again, that was beyond the pale. So what happens, so what I argue is that we should understand. So what happens? Louise Little gets institutionalized. She gets sent to the Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital, and she spent 25 years there. 25 years. And we should think about this as a form of state-sanctioned incapacitation. Indeed, I argue that we should really think of her as a kind of political prisoner, right? Because again, the state targeted her, deliberately targeted her, broke the family up, put the kids in foster care, took the property that the Littles so loved and cherished, right? Oh my goodness. But here's so often again, folks, where the story ends. That, yes, in the autobiography of Malcolm X, the book does note that in 1963, 25 years later, the family, led by Malcolm's sister, Yvonne Little, really spearheaded efforts to get their mother out of that hospital, right? Which they very much understood as a form of imprisonment. And so what's important, folks, that we want you to understand here is that Louise Langdon, yes, she was victimized, but she wasn't a victim, right? This is important. She was victimized, but was not a victim. And again, the story often ends in 1963. She lived another 25 years. She lived another 25 years. And I love this photo. This photo is from 1969. You see her smiling. She's reconnecting with her children, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. She was never again involved in grassroots Garveyite activism. But again, she kept going. Her resilience. And I love this photograph on the right. I didn't take it. Taken by, taken by Deborah Jones, who is the grandchild of Louise and Earl Little, niece of Malcolm X, who lives in Grand Rapids. And in fact, to be clear, the photograph on the left was most likely taken in Grand Rapids. Louise Little spent her last 25 plus years living in Michigan with family, and then her final years in Woodland Park, Michigan, an African-American resort community in central Michigan. Her ashes, her family spread her ashes near the site of this photograph, and I love this photo. It's the last photograph that appears in my book, and I wanted to end this photo as it's just, again, with all that horror and all the violence that she experienced. There's tranquility here, right? There's peace, there's possibility. All right, and I know time's of the essence, so we'll start to wrap things up. But what I would like to do is to speak to her legacy. And fortunately, there's a photograph that I wanted to include that for some reason did not include, but I'd like to just speak to what Louise Langdon means to Black people today, especially here in Canada. Recovering Little's life then amounts to a process. Actually, no, I'll backtrack. Just as African Americans in Omaha and Lansing have recently taken steps to memorialize Louise Little and to promote social change through her life, Black activists in Montreal are doing the same thing. This is no easy task. Until recently, her life has been erased from historical memory in Montreal, the city where she first joined the UNIA. Her erasure from local popular memory is inseparable from the silencing of racism in Canada's past and present that we already discussed. Recovering Little's life, then, amounts to a process for resisting settler colonialism, empire, white supremacy, state violence, and sexual and gender-based violence in Canada, now and the future. In recent years, Black queer feminists in Montreal have been at the forefront in remembering and celebrating the life and legacy of Louise Little, most notably through the Black queer feminist organization Third Eye Collective, formed in Montreal in 2013, comprising Black women from Canada, the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. Third Eye Collective is a grassroots, multi-generational organization dedicated to fighting, quote, against sexual, gender-based, intimate partner and state and institutional violence, end quote, and for Black self-determination in Montreal and beyond through transformative and intersectional justice. The group looks to and celebrates Little Langdon as a Black feminist queer progenitor and powerful symbol of resistance. Third Eye Collective member and Black queer feminist scholar activist Delise Mugabo writes, quote, her vision insists that we continue to create and nurture Black worlds that can imagine and bring forth Black freedoms that are beyond the possible. Louise Langdon taught us not to wait for it, but to make it, end quote. Robin Maynard, the absolutely young and brilliant academic now based at UT, a fellow Black Canadian queer feminist prison abolitionist scholar activist, draws similar conclusions about Little's significance to contemporary struggles around racial and gender justice locally and beyond. Maynard writes, quote, Langdon and her life in Montreal attest to a long ignored history of Black resistance across the city and helps to remind us that just as anti-Blackness has no borders, neither does Black resistance, end quote. For Black feminists, for Black Montreal feminists and queer activists, Little Langdon embodies Black women's historic struggle for freedom and the possibility of a freer future world. And if I may, and to wrap things up, arguably, it's her erasure in Grenada that I find to be especially fascinating and troubling, right? So again, she was born and raised in Grenada. As you may know, and folks, if you're unfamiliar with the Grenada Revolution of 1979 to 1983, Maurice Bishop, the New Jewel movement, the U.S. invasion of the island in 1983, you need to read up on this. This is a photograph that I took 2015 at Fort George, the castle fortress that stands above the harbor in which Louise Langdon sailed out of. And to be clear, she never returned to Grenada. She never, after she left Grenada at about your age, she never returned home. But she never forgot from where she came. But she sailed past this building. And right here, this wall, this is where Maurice Bishop and his lieutenants, as well as his pregnant girlfriend, were shot, assassinated, right here. And what's crazy, like, you see the white tourists, right? And then if you kind of, and then if I move the camera a little bit to the right, then you see all the cruise ships, right? So again, tourism, a new kind of, I don't want to quite say it's analogous to slavery, but again, still the way in which these islands, these countries, right, do not control, right, their own power, their own destinies. But what I'm arguing here, folks, is, right, that, again, Maurice Bishop, the Grenada Revolution, it was, again, inspired by Black Power. It was part of that, those radical third world African liberation movements. Again, it advocated, it advocated for the end of apartheid in South Africa, advanced socialism, right? Participatory democracy, attempted to break the shackles of centuries of foreign domination. And Bishop paid a terrible price for that, no? In fact, and this is crazy, if you've ever been to St. George's, Grenada, there's a mural up there. It's complicated. I absolutely love Grenada. I'm not trying to diss Grenada. I fell in love with it. Amazing, amazing country, amazing people. But there's this mural here that thanks the U.S. for freeing, right? You can see it. Thank you, USA, for liberating us. Now, there's a story on the island that the CIA actually pays people to maintain the mural. I don't know if that's true or not, but still, that they probably do. They probably do. But folks, absolutely, absolutely. But the point that I'm trying to get at is, all right, again, so how do we explain the erasure? So many Grenadians on the island are completely unaware that the mother of Malcolm X was born and raised in Grenada. What I argue is that, again, because, again, the ways in which Malcolm, or rather the Grenada Revolution, remains so contested, right? So contested today in Grenada. The way in which their kind of neoliberal vision of the world so permeates life there and beyond. That to celebrate Louise Little would be to celebrate Malcolm X and therefore Maurice Bishop. You follow? You follow? And of course, as well as just the general sexism within Grenada. But again, I certainly don't want to try to argue that somehow Grenada is more sexist than the U.S. or Canada or elsewhere. But again, but still, there are efforts being made in Grenada at this very moment, especially by this gentleman here. That's Terrence Wilson, a distant relative of Louise Little, Langdon of Malcolm X. He is the world's leading expert on Langdon family history. So much of what I shared with you comes directly from him. And of course, I cite him in my book. This man, he is the world's leading expert on this topic. And he's at the forefront in generating grassroots attention, grassroots focus on Louise Langdon, Malcolm X, and again, not focusing on the past, but to understand them as a place to imagine and strive for a new world. Because just think, again, if we celebrate and acknowledge Louise Langdon, like Robin Maynard and Delise Mugabo, Dr. Mugabo and Dr. Maynard argue, just think about all the other Louise Langdons then and now who are walking around, right? Right? Just think about the possibilities. So, oh, doggone it. So here's actually a slide. I'm sorry, that slide got misplaced. So there's a photograph of Dr. Maynard. Again, he was an absolute brilliant scholar. And of course, there's a photograph of the Montreal UNA, which is still very much alive and well today. So to wrap things up and to move to the Q&A. Louise, Langdon, Garvey, and Malcolm X, unraveling the Canadian links to global Black liberation. The takeaway here, folks, what we want you to understand is that, again, no Louise Langdon, no Malcolm X. And not simply because she was his mama, but how she, again, cultivated that black radical internationalism. And that her politics were very much, again, informed by her family, the culture of opposition in Grenada, and the Garvey movement. And the critical importance of Canada. The critical importance of Canada. If she hadn't gone to Montreal, who knows? Things might have been very, very different. Again, challenging this notion that Canada is a backwater to the African world, that Canada is, no, Canada, class, write it down, right? Again, right? Canada, right? A key site of Black resistance, Black community formation, Black culture, going back centuries. And again, Louise Langdon provides us with a genealogy for understanding not only the past, but the present, and hopefully a better liberated future. Thank you.
Thank you for that very wide-ranging, comprehensive, powerful, poignant discussion of Louise Langdon, connection to Malcolm X and the Caribbean, and also its connection to us as we try and envision a better future. Before we go to the Q&A, just 2 points I'd like to make here. He mentioned Maurice Bishop and the Grenadian Revolution, which is often forgotten because Grenada is one of the smallest islands, not as well known as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, reggae and calypso, but it's also perhaps the most profound, in the English-speaking Caribbean, the most profound example of social emancipatory experience we've ever had, right? And I encourage people to go online. You can actually find a speech of Maurice Bishop that he gave at City University of New York when he was visiting the United States. And he not only places, he was a Marxist, there was no doubt, they were Marxist-Leninists, but he understood he was part of the global Black liberation struggle. And he often said one of his greatest threats to U.S. imperialism was the fact that he could speak in English. Because so many of those revolutions had occurred in non-English speaking countries. Cuba, and I could go on, right? The other point, which is related to Canada, and I think my students will remember this, the largest gathering of Black revolutionary thinkers in North America took place in Montreal, Canada in October of 1916. So Canada is part of this powerful story.
Yes.
So once again, thank you for this powerful and incredible presentation. And now we're open for questions. And hopefully we won't keep Dr. McDuffie too long from a sumptuous dinner.
I'm just warming up.
Questions,
Okay.
comments, points,
And I will moderate. Any questions? Yes, John?
It's more of a comment because of my age. I can make it. Back in the early '80s, when I was in private industry, I attended a meeting in Chicago. I was working for a company, and at the time, quota was just coming in, and one of the district managers was quoting me. He said, "When we go back to work next week, my next 8 hires have to be Black people. I cannot hire anybody else." And the funny thing, in the discussion we were having, he said, "Give it 30 or 40 years, and it's going to bite us in the ass." He said, because this isn't the answer. The answer is we have to tell people what the hell happened, why we are where we are. And I found back in the '80s, because I came from Prince Edward Island, and as one of my friends in Prince Edward, we were a very white province.
Oh, yeah.
Very white. And then going to Chicago and hearing this sort of, like I found the center of a lot of things in the United States when I traveled there for business. The fact that somebody would say he has to do this next week by demand of the federal government, but didn't think it was the answer to what we were what they were facing in the United States. And he asked, were we doing the same thing in Canada? And I think shortly afterwards, we had sort of a nicer version of what it was. But it was interesting to see that in that group of managers that I was standing there was hardly one, I think there was one that said they didn't like what was happening. The rest felt that give it 20 or 30 years, and because we have not told people why we're doing this, we just legislated to do it. I would say, because I really believe that the only way you get rid of all this stuff is education. And I don't think they were doing that to the American public, and that's what I would take away from what you were saying tonight. Without education, it doesn't change.
Well, thank you. I mean, what I would say, and certainly I think it's true that certainly PEI, you know, have a lot of white people, but of course there's that PEI then and now, it has a long historic Black African descended community. So we certainly don't want to whitewash the history of PEI. What I would say to your comment, yes, I certainly emphasize the importance of education, but I was, in some ways, that was targeted, yes, it's targeted to everybody, but especially for people of African descent. And again, thinking about what Garvey was getting at, knowledge of self. And I guess lastly, in terms of the part about quotas and all that, I would say that the problem wasn't with so-called quotas. I think the problem then and now, right, is that you have in the United States, but across the settler world, you have entrenched white supremacy, right? And the ways in which race, class, gender inextricably linked. I would argue that in some ways quotas are needed. I mean, how else are we going to, implement or transform job market without actually, having numbers? But of course, there was then and now serious pushback, right? And then of course, what we're seeing across, especially the U.S. but beyond. I mean, Trumpism is so much about white racial grievances, right? Deeply embedded within the U.S., but beyond. Yeah, please.
So can you have somebody that actually had a hand up first in the back?
Oh, please, yes.
Then,
in the
then,
front.
the one of them you teach.
Yes, please.
So
Hello.
What happened to her kids, Malcolm, and while she was away for 25 whole years? And I guess, how did you even reconnect with her mom after that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, if you read the autobiography, or when you do, in the epilogue, but as well as in the text, Brother Malcolm talks about the pain, right? The pain of what happened to his family. And thank you for the question. It's in the book. I found a letter in the Malcolm X papers at the Schomburg Center, the Schomburg Library in Harlem, where Malcolm is writing to one of his siblings, and he says, people often say that it was Mom who introduced us to Islam. This is in 1949, right? And Malcolm says, they're right, right? They're right. And in this letter, Malcolm also, you see him, yes, he's writing, but he's thinking out loud in some ways, that he understood how when the courts and people started going at, when white folks, and even some black people, right, were going after Louise Little, ridiculing her for having a baby out of wedlock, right? Again, again, the way in which some black people embrace the kind of politics of respectability, as well as right quick, and this is not in the autobiography of Malcolm X, when a farmer offered to give the family the little family pig meat, free meat, and she declined the offer because at the time she was a Seventh-day Adventist. But again, thinking though too, that if her grandparents were Muslim, right, it is not beyond the pale that she herself either was Muslim or again understood or embraced Islamic dietary rules, right? Are folks following me here, right? And so again, what I'm trying to do in this book, I mean, of many things, but trying to rethink narratives of Malcolm X. So long and short, the standard understanding of Malcolm's conversion to Islam was it happens in prison, that he was deaf, dumb, and blind before he was in prison. In prison, he discovers the teachings of the Nation of Islam. A ghost of W.D. Farrar, the founder of the Nation of Islam, visits Malcolm in prison. Malcolm starts to write to Elijah Muhammad and becomes this liberated man, Muslim. Now, I think the story is very complicated. And then indeed, in that letter that I just mentioned, right, Malcolm says, he's putting together the pieces. And he understood, as a young man, he begins to understand these intersections between state violence, and not just state violence, but a gendered state violence going after his mother. So, thank you. Yes, thank you for that.
No, before we get to the next question, I just want to say that we hosted in the 90s Jean Coulot.
Oh, yes,
New Malcolm X.
Yeah.
And he had written a book called Ghosts in My Blood. And I remember saying that when he was talking about Malcolm X said one of the most happiest moments of his life was when he could go with his brothers and sisters and actually rescue his mother from that institution. Tanisha, you have the floor.
You mentioned about her using Norton as the last name and the connection with the father. So I wanted to know more about that.
It's a great question. This will probably always be speculation, right? So again, Norton, she was always known among the family, especially in Grenada, as Louise Langdon, right? Louise Langdon, Lulu, what have you. And she had nothing to do with her family. In fact, her family apparently chased this man off the island, right? In light of the crime that he committed against Louise's mother. But here, she uses Norton. Why? Again, this is speculation. Black people, in particular, black women, you play the cards that you're given, right? And that given that her father, her biological father, was apparently from a kind of elite, white settler family. Maybe that was a way for her to get a passport. Who knows? Again, that's speculation.
That's kind of what I thought. It makes sense that she's trying to use as much power as she can, and she's getting that from that last name. So
Absolutely. And I love this photograph, right? This was taken. She's probably in her early 20s. I mean, she's stunning. But you can see in her face though, there's a confidence there, right? There's a passion, there's a brilliance in it. And again, it's amazing how much Brother Malcolm looks like his mom, right? Yeah. Indeed. More hands, please. In fact, I think we saw Sebi. Please.
With the mask.
Oh, me,
Yes,
actually,
please.
amazing.
And then two people in the back, I see.
Wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the sort of cornerstones of Garveyism.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you for that. So again, just so we're on the same page, so Garveyism, at its core, is a black nationalist ideology. What is black nationalism? So black nationalism really was the first response, first collective response of African people across the Americas. Beyond, of course, jumping from ships or revolting the second they got on the ground. But when African people began to develop, forge a collective sense of self, began forging, in some cases, a kind of racial understanding of the world, again, beyond a kind of ethnic or national-based identity. And at the core of black nationalism is the belief that black people in the States but beyond constitute a nation within a nation within a nation entitled to self-determination. And so we see, and this emerged really at least by the end of the 18th century, countless thinkers, movements, Blyden, I mean, it goes on and on and on. In terms, so at one level, Garvey himself did not articulate anything new per se, that black people had been talking about many of the things that he had been saying for more than a century, right? And not just in the US or not just in Jamaica, but beyond. But again, so this focus, and then of course as well as Pan-Africanism, the kind of corollary, inextricably linked to black nationalism, against consciousness, identity, movement, that again understands that the destinies of all African people are inextricably linked. That might seem at one level obvious or natural to us today, but again, the idea that black people were one people, this was actually a historical process. Now, of course, perhaps Dr. Asante might disagree with me a little bit here, but I think we could make a very strong case here. But again, I mean, Garvey, you can't talk about the civil rights black power movement. You can't talk about Caribbean trade union movement. You can't talk about the Rastafari. You can't talk about the Nation of Islam, more science, African liberation, without centering Garveyism. And I would also argue folks like Louise Langdon to this this dynamic, complex history. So thank you. And did that answer your question?
We have two questions in the back there, but you've thrown a firebrand out with your commentary on Dr. Asante.
Yes.
Which I agree with, but go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. I did my degree in Wisconsin. I've been reading your work for a decade and a half, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's great to see you in person. My question is just about teaching Midwest history, right? Like I teach, you know, mostly under the Great Migration, and teaching Midwest history is say, you know, Black internationalism, and we call it, say, internationalism.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, like, now that I'm teaching here, opening up my lens to diasporic internationalism, right? And so I'm just wondering, could you talk a little bit about sort of where the term, like Great Migration, we have a very American story, and how does this help us sort of move from that? Thank you so much.
Sure, no, thank you. And in some ways, it's a great questions. In some ways, there are some real parallels between the U.S., Midwest, and Canada that if you're familiar with kind of U.S. mythologies, national mythologies, the Midwest is framed as nice, right? As genteel, the land of meritocracy, that racism, white supremacy as it is practiced in the U.S. South was absent in the North, right? Or in the Midwest, in particular. And again, my book very much writes against that. So again, in some ways, very much like Canada, how Canada, it's your national mythology, right? You know, frames Canada. Maybe, yes, maybe there is racism, but it's not as bad as the States, or multiculturalism from sea to sea, right. Oh yes, no. I've been coming to Canada since I've been a babe in arms, so yes, I know Canada very, very well. So there are those parallels. But so what my book is trying to do, and this again speaks to how we understand Canada, Nova Scotia, Macnaughey in relation to global Africa, that there's a tendency in the States looking at African American history, especially in the Midwest, to frame it within the confines of the U.S., within the confines of the Great Migration, so approximately from 1900 to 1970, 1915 to 1970, approximately 6 million African Americans migrated from the South to the North and U.S. West, right? So the largest internal migration in U.S. history. But again, what my book does, again, I start this story prior to the 20th century. So again, I'm trying to rethink genealogies of Garveyism, try to again to locate it, root it, and I use that term intentionally, root it, and again, a long history of black nationalism, Pan-African struggle, resistance of black people. So there's that aspect, and at the same time, and this is so germane to our understanding of Canada, that when we talk about diaspora in the U.S., or rather the diaspora, the U.S. in relation to the diaspora, the global dispersion of African people, we typically focus on Harlem, New Orleans, the Chesapeake, Charleston, and again, I'm not saying that Charleston, South Carolina. I'm not saying that we shouldn't write or focus on those places. But again, how does the diaspora, how does including or incorporating rather the Midwest, how does that prompt us to think about Africa, global Africa differently? How does incorporating Nova Scotia, how does centering, how does appreciating Canada and its long, rich, complex, paradoxical history, how does that shape and transform our understanding of global Africa? How does that change and transform our understanding of Canada? Folks following us here, right? So again, getting beyond this idea that Canada is a backwater, right? Oh, no. Again, y'all are in some ways, have been at the front lines, right? In the front lines of the African world. So I hope I answered the question.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And before we get to the next question, talking about how these transnational context and modes of thinking help us understand much better and situate things much better. In the face of what's emerging as a true Canadian nationalism right now, perhaps that allows us to think beyond these simple dichotomies to find better ways
Absolutely.
to deal with the existential threat we face.
Indeed. In fact, I'm a bit upset that I haven't, spoken about it explicitly. And again, this could get me in trouble, given the ways in which scholars are being reported. But thinking about Palestine, the ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide that is occurring right now, I think the Darwin movement provide a lens, a framework for understanding how those forces, genocide, apartheid, how they occurred then, how they're occurring now, and how black people found ingenious ways to resist the violence, the settler colonialism of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy.
Mr. Fraser?
Yeah, actually, you know what? I kind of just want to build on what you were just speaking on.
Yeah.
Because I think kind of in the age where we're kind of moving into more of a multicultural sphere, especially in the Canadian scope, a lot of our youth aren't really focused on knowing and centering themselves in that one identity. So I'm wondering if you think that there is a purpose or a utility towards Garveyism in the present contemporary day.
Absolutely.
And if there is, how would you frame it?
Absolutely.
Towards like the future of it, I guess.
Absolutely, great question. I think, again, and I've said it, and thank you for the question. First and foremost, it speaks to the importance, and I've said this now countless times, right? Knowing yourself, right? Knowing your history, taking classes, especially given that we have so many undergrads here, taking classes in Black Studies, in Africana Studies, right? Because the way in which Africana Studies was understood, right? It was then and now understood not just about facts and famous people, no, right? Right. That it was about that. It's about transformative change, which helps explain why Trump and the powers that be are coming after us. I mean, literally. I'm not being hyperbolic here, right? I'm being serious, right? Right? Why? Because the experiences of African descended people here in the United States, wherever, they challenge prevailing narratives, prevailing understandings of the world, right? And that knowledge is dangerous. And again, this photograph, I dig it, right? The Glace Bay, UNIA, Liberty Hall, something that Black nationals, I think, have done perhaps better than anyone else. First and foremost, how Garvey and others understood how white supremacy was baked, was an intrinsic part in the making of the modern world, right? The enslavement of African peoples, right? The attempted eradication against indigenous First Nation people, right? Not a kind of corollary aspect of the modern world, right? But a critical one. But also the importance of building independent, autonomous institutions. I think, especially now, and I just had this conversation last night with a colleague. And yes, we were always cognizant of how academia was a contested site space for black scholars, black studies, Africana studies, gender and women's studies. We always knew that, yeah, they might try to kind of pull the rug from under us, right? But that was kind of, it was still kind of like abstract, right? What's happening right now? Again, if you've been following what's going on in the States and beyond, right? They're ending, right? This whole effort against so-called DEI, right? Stripping Colombia of $400 million of federal loans because of so-called anti-Semitism. You have pro-Palestine. No, this is a sham. This is about shutting down dissent, right? This is about challenging mythologies of the United States as the freest, greatest country in the world. Again, challenging genocide, asking tough questions. That's what these fields have always been about, right? And who knows? Again, I'm saying all this stuff. I don't know where it's going. I'm going home and I'm going back to the States in 2 days. And I'm thinking, seriously, who knows? U.S. Customs might give me a hard time. And y'all might think I'm being crazy.
No, you're not.
On my campus, right? So I will be, if all works out, because my job has to be approved by the Board of Trustees. And if you know anything about the University of Illinois, we've had a scholar by the name of Stephen Salida, a very prominent Palestinian American scholar who fired off a bunch of critical texts about Israel and the 2014 Gaza conflict. What happened to Dr. Slider? He got unhired. He got fired by the U of I. But what happened just a few weeks ago on my campus at the University of Illinois? 2 FBI agents showed up at the office of a colleague of a Center for African Studies affiliate and asked her why she was visiting so many African countries. This is on my campus, folks. This isn't like just, I'm being paranoid here, right? This stuff is happening in real time. Maybe one last question?
One last question.
Any last question?
Any other last questions?
You can ask mine.
Yes, please.
Dr. Florian Bonner.
Yes, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure to listen to you and to learn from you.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question. Something just struck me when you were talking about the migratory paths that the Littles took.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about why Omaha.
Yeah. Sure.
And I'll tell you why I'm curious.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
In the late 1880s, early 1890s,
Yeah.
Former enslaved or free blacks who lived in southwestern Ontario were buying land in Omaha.
Mhm.
So people were part of that migration out of Canada as well.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious what was happening in Omaha that made everyone flock to it.
Great question. So Omaha, Nebraska, the largest city in Nebraska. Actually, I'm going out there next week to give a talk because in Omaha, again, the birthplace of Malcolm X. To be clear, again, that's where he was born. In Omaha, people black folk, then in that right, are publicizing, or again, ongoing campaigns to publicize the importance of Omaha and of Malcolm X. Great question. So why Omaha? So in 1919, it was part of what was called the Red Summer of 1919, in which there were more than 24 so-called race riots right across the U.S., Chicago, and then a few years prior to that in East St. Louis in 1917, 1919, Washington, D.C., it goes on and on. But there was also a so-called race riot in Omaha. And to be clear, what were race riots? That term is really in some ways a misnomer. They were pogroms, right? They were white folks going into black neighborhoods after rumors of a black man raping a white woman or some kind of contest between black people and white. Basically, again, this is following the end of the First World War. This helps explain why Garveyism gained such traction, where black people were, and again, and we saw a kind of global anti-colonial revolt across Africa and Asia, the 1917 Russian Revolution, one of the most important events of the 20th century. So you have, again, these forces of reaction versus forces of resistance. And so in Omaha, there was a race riot. A black man was accused of raping a white woman. The black man was lynched. And it shows you how crazy white supremacy is. Not only did white folks go into the black neighborhood on the north side of Omaha where Brother Malcolm came up and shot and killed people, but whites also went after the mayor, the white mayor of Omaha, and they tried to lynch him. I mean, this is something. But what caught Garvey's attention, because Garvey wrote and spoke about Omaha, because black folks in Omaha, like us, were fought back. And in the Negro world, Garvey said that the way in which black folks fought back in Omaha was going to be like our Waterloo, right? And, reference to Napoleon and that battle that he lost that ended his, right? But again, right? So apparently the UNIA Garvey, whom the Littles apparently knew, Louise Langdon apparently knew, again, this is not in the autobiography of Malcolm X, that Garvey assigned the Littles to go to Omaha to build the UNIA. Yes. Yeah, and that's how the Littles, that's how Louise Langdon, that's how they got to Omaha. And of course, in 1925, they had their most famous child, Malcolm X, whom of course, folks, this year is celebrating his 100th centenary, right? So please, read up, and thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Dr. McDuffie. And I should also mention that you mentioned as Dr. Audubon over chat note, 1919 also witnessed a race riot here in Canada as well.
That's right.
So that's all. But thank you so much for that comprehensive, incredibly extensive, detailed, passionate presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming out, okay, especially on a Monday night, and staying so attentive.
Yes,
and I wish you could go on. I know there are more questions, but we need to give him a rest.
Oh, I'm good.
But thank you again, and we hope to have him back in the future. Thank you, thank you. Also want to thank our Black and African Diaspora Studies social media who set up the, among other things, to help publicize the event, set up the streaming, and brought me, who's simply a Facebook person dating himself, into the 21st century. And please grab the rest of the drinks and the catering.
Back home for dinner. It's downtown.